Hello, everyone. I'm Ali Aslan, international TV presenter and journalist. And on behalf of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second edition of the Web Talk series titled, "This Service is Currently Unavailable." The series aims to examine how internet shutdowns are threatening democracies worldwide, a very timely issue. The UN Human Rights Council has deemed internet shutdowns a human rights violations, yet governments around the world are increasingly restricting access to the internet, especially during elections and anti-government protests. Myanmar is just one of the very latest and most current examples. Asia is disproportionately affected by internet shutdowns. So today we will focus our attention on the situation on the Asian continent. And for that, the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation has put together a wonderful panel for great experts and guests to speak about this in great detail and with great expertise. Ramanjit Singh Chima serves as Asia Policy Director and Senior International Counsel at Access Now. For those who may not know, Access Now is an international organization which has dedicated itself to defending digital rights around the world. Delighted to welcome Shashank Mohan, who's a project manager at the Center for Communication Governance at National Law University in Delhi. Both are based and joining us from New Delhi, India. Giving the German/European perspective, joining us is the German member of Parliament, Gide Jensen. She's also sitting on the Committee on Human Rights and Humanitarian Aids in the German Bundestag. And last but certainly not least, the former journalist and currently the project director of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation based in Thailand and Myanmar. He joins us from Bangkok today, Frederick Spohr. Thank you so much to the four of you for joining us. Before I hand it over to Raman to give us a quick overview of the situation in Asia, let me remind all of you who are joining us now, viewing this particular discussion, you are more than welcome to join it by submitting questions to our distinguished panelists through the Q&A function. With that, I am more than happy to yield the floor to Raman Chima, who will kick off this session with a quick and short overview of Asia, of what the situation is like in Asia when it comes and with regards to internet shutdowns. Raman, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Ali. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all today. As Ali mentioned, I work with Access Now. We're an international human rights organization that looks at advancing and protecting the rights of users at risk, in particular around digital rights and policy. Our organization follows the issues around internet shutdowns very closely. We were actually originally born as an organization that provided digital security help to activists and others seeking to advance democracy across the world. And we grew functions around public policy and advocacy. And several years ago, along with many other organizations, we noted the growth of the phenomena of internet shutdowns. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the topic or that particular definition, it's very important to note that it has a definition. Internet shutdowns refers to the intentional disruption of internet communications on the direction of government agencies in order to frustrate users from being able to access communications, collaborate, and do other measures. It is intentional disruption. It may not be the entire internet always going off, although unfortunately far too often that does take place. But it might also be the switching off of mobile internet connectivity, which is particularly common in the developing world, as well as throttling and intentional slowdown of services with the intent of frustrating communications. And the many activists and organizations who work on this globally actually are part of a joint coalition. It's called the Keep It On Coalition. I encourage you to just type that into your search engine of choice and see the information about the coalition. You can join it today as well if you're an activist or an organization, a nonprofit organization in the space. And the Keep It On Coalition tracks the issue of internet shutdowns very closely. It advocates against them. And Keep It On members globally also track shutdowns very closely, release their individual reports. And every year we also publish an annual report that summarizes developments we are seeing. And what you'll see shortly from me will be the top highlights from our 2020 Keep It On report, which was published just yesterday. And it helps explain how internet shutdowns are such a grave concern today for all of us. And if you give me a moment, I'll make sure that's up. and you should be all able to see this now. But the report was released yesterday, and it's an appropriate title in our view. It's the internet shutdowns. The story is essentially one of shattered dreams and lost opportunities, because especially during the year of the pandemic, we saw the internet shutdowns continued. The total number of internet shutdowns reduced a little bit, but remained very high. And more importantly, during a year when the internet was even more crucial for connectivity globally. And in particular, we saw very concerning developments across the Asia Pacific region. And I'm going to just let you see here to get a top level overview. As you saw, there were 155 shutdowns documented globally by the Keep It On Coalition and curated by Access Now, of which 29 countries very specifically hit the kill switch to disrupt internet access. And unfortunately, a very high number of these shutdowns in terms of numbers as well as intensity and duration was in the Asia Pacific region. And in particular, and it's unfortunate that I have to say this as an Indian citizen, the world's largest democracy, India, was actually the world's worst perpetrator of internet shutdowns. And this is an unfortunate distinction that India has now held for several years running. It is the highest number of internet shutdowns by a significant number, and I'll talk about that briefly later. But as you notice, shutdowns took place in other parts of the region as well, including in Pakistan, parts of Central Asia, which is close to the Asia-Pacific region, but also most notably in Bangladesh, Myanmar, as well as in Vietnam. In particular, the two shutdowns that really, or I'd say three shutdowns that particularly were distinctive during this time. One, of course, was the long continuous internet shutdown in Jammu and Kashmir in India after the abrogation of Article 370, the unique constitutional provision that safeguarded some of Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy under the Indian Union. And what followed that was a total communications blackout that continued as an internet shutdown, particularly of 3G and 4G services for a very long time. Alongside that, the other long internet shutdown that took place in 2020 was in the Rakhine and Chin provinces of Myanmar, where particularly the Rohingya and Chin communities were being targeted by the Myanmar government. And as some of you know, at the start of this year, the Myanmar coup took place, for which an internet shutdown accompanied the coup, and there have been shutdowns now nearly every day by the military. But what happened was, the second day was that the military government actually rescinded the shutdowns in Rakhine and Chin, but instead shut down the entire country a couple of days later. The important note to see here, as I said, is that it impacts vulnerable communities, particularly in a disproportionate way. And the other third shutdown I therefore note in that context is the targeting of refugees and unfortunate restrictions on internet access in the refugee camps in Bangladesh for displaced peoples, both internally displaced peoples, but also the Rohingya community being forced back into Bangladesh by the violence and allegedly genocidal activity they were suffering in Myanmar. And these are concerns that during the pandemic, when the internet was so crucial, when access to digital records and electronic services was so important for public health, you saw governments continuing to do so, despite the statements made by international policymakers, health professionals, and others. I'm going to stop presenting so you don't have to see that anymore. 1 second. And therefore, it's very important to note that internet shutdowns have been very concerning in 2020. And in the early part of 2021, we see this particular increasing phenomena of shutdowns being used to target protesters, people who governments don't necessarily like, even if they're just peacefully protesting. And the concern with internet shutdowns is not just disruption of critical ability to speak or associate. It is also that it provides a shield of impunity to security forces, to police actors, acting beyond their legal powers, acting beyond what democracies regard as acceptable, to commit violence, to deprive people of human rights. And essentially, it removes that critical ability to monitor people, to make sure that rights are being respected and that democratic institutions respect each other. And that is something we are seeing in this region. The other thing that I will leave you with is that it's not always a total internet shutdown. Often there may be localized disruption, the switching off of internet in a district, which of course in Asia can mean millions of people. It can mean switching off a cell tower in a populated urban area that suddenly casts protesters in darkness. And even sometimes throttling, the blocking of, for example, VPN services or of apps upon whom people depend. For example, in Myanmar, by the third day of the coup there, the military started blocking access to Facebook services. And it's a trope, but it's a valid trope that in Myanmar, for the majority of Burmese nationals who were online, for them, Facebook was the internet. And disrupting access to what everyday people may use is in effect a shutdown as well. And these are concerning developments that we need to monitor. There have been also patches of light in 2019 and 2020 with groups going to courts and succeeding in wins. For example, in the Asia-Pacific region, the Jakarta Administrative Court ruled in favor of civil liberties groups who challenge the internet shutdown in Papua New Guinea, but there are also disappointments. For example, the Indian Supreme Court did rule that internet shutdowns impacted fundamental rights, but they issued a limited ruling that gave a lot of space for the government to continue issuing shutdowns in a problematic way. And what that therefore means is more work by all of us, more monitoring, and rather something that we should remember, that there is hope, but we have to fight for it.
There's hope, but we have to fight for it, says Raman. Thank you so much for this quick overview. We will, of course, talk in more detail about where hope can be derived from, what solution can be offered in order to improve the situation. But thank you so much for now. I will come back to you, of course, in just a moment. But let me move to Shashank, because you have, Raman, mentioned that India is the worst perpetrator in Asia. If I understood correctly, India was responsible for almost 70% of the world's documented shutdowns. They are very widespread and common, Shashank. As a matter of fact, we've seen government shutdowns implemented in response to the ongoing farmers' protests, the Citizenship Amendment Bill protests in Jammu and Kashmir, and so on, so forth. How are these internet shutdowns, Shashank? How are these shutdowns affecting people's lives in general in India?
Yes, just thanks for your question, and thanks, Ali. It's great to be joining everyone for this conversation. I think it's a very important subject area for us to talk about. I think this question is very valid. India has one of the largest internet populations of the world, possibly the second largest, and we have almost more than 500 million people using the internet in India. Indians use the internet for everyday activities, whether it's sort of ordering food, their transportation, looking at location, using location services, using the internet to gather information. And I think, as Raman was pointing out, during the pandemic, it's become extremely crucial to get access to legitimate sources of information to gather relevant information on how the COVID-19 pandemic is evolving, how to protect ourselves, wear masks. We've been seeing a lot of misinformation around vaccines, not just in India, but around the world. And the internet offers an unparalleled opportunity for Indians to access legitimate information on vaccinations as well. It's important to point out that a lot of today's growth of India's internet population is also coming from non-urban centers. And we expect this to sort of continue to grow in the coming 3 to 5 years. And possibly, in half a decade, probably hit 900 million users, or almost 1 billion users. And 1 billion users also relying on the internet for not just basic services, but government benefits and government services, which are deeply tied to a lot of basic services, like food ration for a large part of the country. When we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, everything from the conversation around contact tracing apps to even, we've just started the vaccination drives in India. That's also deeply tied to digital access. You have to register on a portal, and then you have to go and sort of access the vaccination. So just trying to point to the fact that internet is such a crucial aspect of everyday life in India, and any shutdown really significantly impacts the everyday civil liberties and rights of citizens. I think one point which I just want to emphasize on, and I think Raman was also saying this, was how the internet has enabled minority groups and communities around the world to find a voice, especially groups and communities who have historically, in the social fabric of various nations, and especially in India, have sometimes not able to find their voice. And a majority of these people are now coming online in India, and they feel empowered, and they feel that they have the right to sort of voice their concerns. Pointing to the fact that communities and groups who have historically not had the opportunity, not had the voice under India's democratic system, have now gained those sort of rights and access to their voice with the internet. When you shut down the internet, it acts as a double whammy or a double hammering effect on these sort of minority groups and communities, where because of their historical sort of discrimination, an internet shutdown acts like a sort of it doubles the problem of their voice not reaching the larger population. So I think quickly to summarize what I've been saying, that a large part of Indian life, sometimes very essential and basic services, are accessed via the internet in India. So shutdowns really impact that. Secondly, minority groups and communities significantly get impacted, and their rights substantively get impacted by internet shutdowns.
Thank you so much, Shashank, for this quick summary of the situation in India, and pointing out, of course, that it's particularly disconcerting. The restriction and shutting down of information is particularly disconcerting and dangerous, even in times of a pandemic, where the right information can make the difference between life and death. We'll go more into detail, but let me bring in Friedrich Spohr here, the project director for the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation, who is responsible for both Thailand and Myanmar, two countries that have been in the news lately due to government protests or even a military coup, as we saw in Myanmar. Friedrich, you're joining us from Bangkok. We talked detail now about and length about India. What's the situation both in Thailand, where you are based at the moment, but also Myanmar, which is dominating the news?
Yeah, as we talk about shutdowns, Thailand, I can speak about very briefly. So there are no shutdowns in Thailand, but of course, the situation is not good anyway. We have the cybercrime bill that can bring you into jail quite fast. We have defamation law, so we don't have a free internet in Thailand, and freedom of speech is very limited. In regards to shutdown, it's quite okay, or actually it is okay. 2014, Facebook was blocked for half an hour, but that's the only incident I can remember right now when it comes to blocking. Of course, certain websites are also blocked, foreign websites. I think more interesting right now is, of course, the situation in Myanmar. Just after the coup, or when the coup started, the internet was nearly shut down completely for several days. Not only the internet, it was even difficult to reach my team via phone. So literally, the country was sealed off. It was like covered for a period of time. Right now, the situation is like that every night from 1 a.m. till 9 a.m., the internet is nearly completely off. So there is data suggesting that 12% connectivity or 12% of the data volume or connectivity is still works compared to the normal levels. So there are some ways, if you have international SIM cards, there are some twists and turns that you can take to still be connected, but it's very, very difficult and you need some technical expertise. Yeah, but the thing is that even at daytime, you can realize that more and more applications are blocked. So Facebook is blocked, Twitter is blocked, and they add more and more applications you don't have access to. It's also now Google, it's Wikipedia. Of course, those are crucial services for information when it comes to every aspect of life, and they are blocked more and more. If you look into the future, the situation might become even worse, because right now there might be a new bill, a cybercrime bill, that might make it even illegal to use a VPN. And that would basically mean that you cannot even circle your way around those restrictions, and you're getting more and more sealed off from the real world. So there are really serious and concerning issues right now, and the situation is getting more and more dark, I would say.
The situation is getting increasingly dark when it comes to access to the internet in Asia, says Friedrich Spohr. Gide Jensen, let me bring in Gide Jensen here, member of German Parliament and an expert on human rights and humanitarian aid. We've listened to Raman now speak in general about Asia, Shashank about India, and Friedrich giving us an overview of what the situation like in Thailand and Myanmar. From a perspective of a German parliamentarian with a focus on human rights, how do you assess the situation in Asia? What do you make of it?
Well, I think, thank you very much for these insights from very different countries. I think from a German perspective or a European perspective, this question about that we still have countries that deny the reality that access to internet is a human right, because it is the source for so many people, for billions of people to get information. Sometimes misleading information. I think that's something we should talk about. But the question is, how does the government, how do authorities deal with this misleading information? Do we block it just because we think it's misleading, or do we try to counter it with good information that has been vetted by official sources, by government sources or ministries, by experts? And in my opinion, I think Ali, you said that in the very beginning. For people who have a phone, this is their life, this is their hub to the world, and if this hub is being denied by authorities, sometimes even by authorities that do not have the right to block the internet or certain services. I think we see that in Myanmar at the moment. I think Frederick can talk maybe a little bit more about that, but also in India. And the German government here, for example, I experienced that last year when I sent a formal inquiry to our government. I asked them how they assess the role of internet shutdowns that has been increased over time. And I think it is, or I was surprised, negatively surprised, that the government here in Germany has not quite had this topic and this important question on their agenda. We have a free internet here, so it's rather normal for us to just know that we can access all sites. But this is not true for every country. Even in Belarus, for example, which is a part of Europe, we experience, or people experience, internet shutdowns. So I think the German government needs to take into account that it's also on them, and a role for them to, in every talk they have with officials from India, from Myanmar. We have a special debate in the afternoon in the German Bundestag about the situation in Myanmar, to address this topic and to not go back to normal, because whenever role models, apparent role models such as Germany, are not mentioning and questioning other countries about these actions, I think it becomes the new normal, that it's part of a conflict that we experience in certain countries. And I think this is a very crucial question that we need to address more here in Germany. And maybe one last thing, I think the role of China and these different kinds of role models needs to be discussed more, because we experience, and I did that when I was in Geneva, when the Universal Periodic Review of Germany and afterwards of China took place. And when China talked about the German Netzdg, they used it as a positive example for China in their legislation to use blockage of internet, of certain information on the internet, and they justified it by taking Germany as an example for, well, you're doing it as well, for other reasons and with other kind of regulation. But if we have these role models, apparent role models, I think other countries are trying to justify their actions with it. And China is okay with what is going on in Myanmar, and they're not questioning, but rather supporting these movements. And I think that is very dangerous.
Dangerous indeed. Thank you, Guida, for your honest assessment that internet shutdowns are not really recognized in Germany, or perhaps in Europe or the Western world for that matter, as a severe and grave danger to democracies and human rights. Raman, we've just did around the first 25 minutes we spent on analyzing the situation. I think we're all on the same page. It's quite gloomy. It's not positive, could even get worse, as Frederick has pointed out. Now, in the remaining 25, 30 minutes, we'd like to come up perhaps with a couple of constructive suggestions. and thoughts of how to improve this. Raman, Gita has just said that we in Europe, we don't really have internet shutdowns worldwide, and in Asia in particular, not so much on our radar. Could international pressure help, or could it potentially even backfire?
I think international consensus against internet shutdowns is a critical requirement, and in fact, it's slowly happening. It's important to note that so far, internet shutdowns have been brought up in the UN Human Rights Council's regular resolutions around internet freedom. There are sometimes attempts by states to water down that language, and I would say there's a considerable discussion that some states don't want it to be more aggressive, and unfortunately, sometimes certain EU member states or states within the EU's larger neighborhood don't take a strong enough position on that. So that's a place where the EU as a body, in terms of its consolidated foreign policy position in UN fora, can take a lead. And there, Germany in particular being aggressive and clear on that would be very important and helpful. You want those standards to be strengthened, and you want it to be very clear. For example, that internet shutdowns are not a tool to combat misinformation. And if you speak to fact-checking groups, newsrooms, and others, they actually say that. Fact checkers on the ground, not policy people or activists like myself, not even lawyers, but fact checkers say an internet shutdown makes our life very difficult. It does not help combat misinformation. And again, speaking very bluntly with you all and with the people watching, there's sometimes this tendency when seeing news about how disinformation has resulted in violence or in tense communal situations in part of the global south, for European or North American audiences to say, well, maybe sometimes the internet can be a bad thing. I would say no, certain time internet tools can be a bad thing, but the internet is always a good, and access to the internet is critical to prevent violence. Jan Reisdak, a researcher who used to be at Stanford University and now ranking digital rights, noted that internet shutdowns actually help create more violence when they occur, and therefore you need strong actions. The other things that we do definitely need is pressure on telecommunications companies. Telcos ultimately are the agency through whom internet shutdowns normally occur. The government sends a directive, as has happened in Myanmar. In some cases, you see actions from telecom companies that are human rights respecting. Either they try to restrict the shutdown or they try to provide information about it. An example of that is Telenor, the Norwegian telecom company with a subsidiary in Myanmar, whose local subsidiary has sought to push back or provide information on shutdowns, but recently can't make it available easily because the government has restricted it. But Telenor is an outlier, unfortunately, in the global telecom sector. You see telecom companies that don't provide this information or that provide very basic statements that staff security and compliance with local regulators is the most important thing. Please don't ask us for more. And when those companies do business through Europe or are licensed in European entities, they should be required, no matter where they operate, to push back against shutdowns and at the very least make them public and provide as much information as possible. The Keep It On report that you saw is mostly data that we have to source through local partners and through news coverage. The telecom companies know all of the shutdowns, but we don't have access to that data set. So those are examples of that, of what can occur. And lastly, you do want urgent action sometimes to target the private sector vendors that governments might try to use to force shutdowns or do censorship. And for example, on Myanmar, very specifically, over 150 organizations have written a letter addressed to the Security Council urging for an arms embargo to Myanmar that should target surveillance technologies and censorship technologies as well. Europe already has laws on that. You need more action. And as the New York Times revealed earlier this week, companies are already bypassing existing restrictions on Myanmar. So you want to make sure that these third-party vendors, whether in Europe, whether in Israel, whether in the United States, or whether in China or Singapore, cannot do business there. And lastly, the EU is a critical trading partner to ASEAN and ASEAN's member states, to India, to Pakistan, to Bangladesh. Bring this up regularly in every conversation you do there. Democracies owe it each other to be frank with each other, and the EU should do that.
The EU should do that, should apply pressure. International pressure can work, says Raman, not just on governments, but also on the private sector, on internet providers. Shashank, you've talked about the situation in India, gave us a good overview. What's the way out here? Do you have anything on top in addition to what Raman said, as far as the recipe is concerned, to improve the situation when it comes to government internet shutdowns?
Yes, thanks, Ali. I think I do want to I do want to point out that India is a constitutional democracy. There are institutions built in within the country which are which their duty is to protect the constitutional freedoms and fundamental rights and human rights and civil liberties of everyday citizens. And as we've been talking, it's fairly well established how impactful internet shutdowns are on the everyday civil liberties of citizens. I think, also adding to Raman, I just feel that domestically within the country, civil society, academia, and I'd like to extend that point, even businesses have a very crucial role to play to ensure there's awareness about internet shutdowns. How there's an economic impact about internet shutdowns. Various international organizations have done studies to point to the sort of massive economic impact, which regions in India suffer due to internet shutdowns. So businesses do play an important role. They need to recognize the sort of impact of internet shutdowns. I also want to point to the fact that the judiciary in India needs to play a very crucial role. Raman was pointing out to a sort of important judgment, I would say, early last year, which came out from the Supreme Court. As Raman was saying, that it did sort of clarify certain points, like the importance of notifying the general public by the government when there's an internet shutdown. And the universally recognized, especially in Europe, the principle of proportionality and the application of that when deciding when internet needs to be shut down. But my point is, and I'm going to extend that point and say that going on to India's international commitments to human rights, I think it's time that Indian courts and future courts will need to recognize access to internet as a fundamental right in India. The court, in another was seen, as we've been seeing, the Supreme Court judgment early last year has already recognized the freedom of expression and the freedom to trade and do business as fundamental rights over the internet. And I would just say that that's the next step which India needs to move forward in its constitutional democracy.
Thank you so much. Before we proceed and advance this discussion, let me just remind those watching the discussion, you're more than welcome to chime in to address your questions that you may have or comments to our four panelists through the Q&A function. We have approximately 30 minutes left in this discussion. So if you do have them, don't hold back. This is a good time now. Friedrich, we talked about what international pressure can or cannot do. For you as a representative from a German foundation based in Asia, a foundation that is devoted and defined by liberal policies and its emphasis on liberal policies, how much can you actually influence on the ground, Friedrich?
I think it's not of course, we also have to raise our voice, but I think mostly it's the responsibility of the German and the European government right now to keep on pressure the junta in Myanmar. The US already announced sanctions. The EU is currently working on it. It has been decided that there will be sanctions, but now it's kind of figured out how to do it and who to target. So of course, we need to pressure the junta to not only to open internet, but actually to step back and give room again to a civil government, right? The internet shutdown right now in Myanmar is a symptom. The actual disease is, of course, the coup, and that needs to be targeted. But of course, if you have a democratic government, I'm pretty confident that the internet shutdowns will also stop. So of course, the West has a role, and I think, of course, also China has a role. They need to, they are not super happy about that coup, definitely not. I think they want to have stability within their neighborhoods, and they also need to pressure the junta to find a compromise or even step back. And of course, also the ASEAN members need to end their policy of complete getting out of the affairs of the member states. The ASEAN member states always say, okay, that's an internal affair, we don't deal with that. That's the usual argument of the ASEAN member states. But I think in that case, where human rights are so violent, so cruelly violated, I think ASEAN also needs to to raise its voice. And some member states also criticized the coup Singapore did, for example. But they need to be louder, and they need to be more frank on what's happening in Myanmar. I just want to add one thing that Shashank said, that business is very affected, of course, by internet shutdowns. I think one interesting thing in Myanmar is right now, why do they keep the internet open at daytime? And one theory is that the country would simply stop completely working if the internet would be stopped at daytime, because the financial system relies on the internet. Even ATMs, they will not work when the internet is off. And the junta is right now trying to get some kind of normality in Myanmar. Of course, Myanmar is far away from that, but the banks are closed because because the bank clerks are on strike. You can still do transactions, but of course you need the internet for that. So this is one thing where you can see that the internet is so crucial for business, that there is a strong linkage between shutdowns and the economy. Also apps for so many traders in Asia, in Myanmar, apps like Facebook or Line and so on are so crucial ways to sell their businesses, to sell their products. So that you cannot simply stop Facebook. You destroy the business of millions immediately.
So the impact is clearly felt on so many different levels for so many people on the Asian continent. Gita, Raman has pointed out 2-3 things that Europe/Germany can do, should do, in order to advance and improve the situation in Asia when it comes to internet shutdowns. I want to give you the opportunity to respond directly.
Well, I would rather repeat what Raman said, because there needs to be more emphasis on that. But I'm not going to do that. But I'd like to just state one point that is very critical from a German perspective on my own government. But sometimes I think it is also our mindset here in Germany that needs to change more quickly, because not only in the pandemic, but before that, when I came to the German Bundestag as an MP, we had to learn that most of the work is done by facsimiles. I don't even know whether you know how these things work, because it's so ancient as a technology. And here we're still working with these kind of technologies from other centuries. And this mindset is this mindset is changing not fast enough for countries in comparison for Asian countries in comparison. So sometimes I think in Germany, this is the reason why we don't have it on the radar, or government doesn't have it on the radar so much. So what I would recommend my government doing more is to intensify the knowledge and the exchange of knowledge there is. And we can learn something from you guys in India, in also parts of China, because if we would work with the good hackers to learn about certain tricks to avoid these blockages and internet shutdowns, we could collaborate with and fund organizations that work in these areas, and also encourage journalism that is, I think, very crucial at one point to provide this information that is so much needed. And on the other hand, journalism is only possible if you have free access and all access to internet. So we just last year we had a public hearing on digital human rights. So in our committee there is some talks and discussion about this area, and still Chaos Computer Club, for example, they said the whole debate about darknet, for example, is a very negative connotated thing here in Germany, but in other countries it is the only way that journalists or human rights defenders can work and make their way through the loopholes that they still find. So maybe Germany should encourage these kind of works, and also try to learn from organizations that are working every day in this area.
Indeed, learning from the work of organizations such as Access Now, Of course, and I think you're right. You have talked about the shortcomings of Germany when it comes to digitalization. I think something that's been painfully exposed here during the pandemic. Before I go to Rahman and open it up again, Gita, I want to pose a question that we've reached from in the Q&A function from Teresa. She says, do you have something we could do or is there something we could do as private internet users in Western European countries to help against internet restrictions in other countries? So we talked about what the government can do, but what can private internet users do?
I would recommend talking about it in every way you have, in every forum you have. So I'm also not, I'm a private person who has free access to the internet. And I experience so many very personal stories where people tell me in my capacity as an MP, how they cannot, or how they are not able to use the internet freely. And I just talked to an activist in Hong Kong where she said, well, we are very dependent also on private people from all over the world talking about that internet shutdowns or the right to digital human rights and the freedom of expression on the internet is a very crucial thing. So if society brings up this pressure towards governments all over the world, I think governments cannot deny this discussion has taken place. That's a very long-term thing, but I think it is one that is working. And I just, when you pose that question, I thought about this slogan that Myanmar protesters are currently stating all the time. We're like water, you cannot stop us. And I think that's the sense that we need to apply in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Rahman. I'm sure you have something to say in reply to Gita.
I do. I did want to answer one of the questions that came up in chat from Therese, because I think it's useful to understand what sort of actions are taking place. And her question was about what happened in relation to Facebook agreeing to block content in Vietnam in early 2020. And it's an important situation to just quickly recount. What essentially took place there was Vietnam passed a very controversial cybersecurity law that gave them enhanced powers, some of them perhaps legitimate and justified, just about exerting their jurisdiction on tech companies operating within the country. But as you know, in the context of very limited independent checks in Vietnam, and also a system of incredible number of political censorship orders, seeking very, very honestly from the regional context. And what happened was Facebook was restricting or being cautious about the requests it accepted from the Vietnamese government. But then what happened was, and this has been reported, Facebook has not fully confirmed it, but it seems clear, that essentially the Vietnamese government quietly put pressure on telecom providers and others in Vietnam and in the nearby region to essentially disrupt Facebook's cache servers and content distribution architecture in the region, to slow down Facebook so badly that it essentially could not operate there without legally blocking it actually. And Facebook took a decision that was so much pressure that they were going to start complying with Vietnamese government requests more actively, although still doing checks. But the problem is, one, that I think governments needed to call out Vietnam and say, you may wish to extend your jurisdiction or perhaps your idea of sovereignty, but surreptitiously throttling an entire internet service is not okay. That is not acceptable behavior for any state in the modern 21st century. If a private company had done that in Europe or the United States, that would be a network neutrality violation. How can a government doing that quietly for an entire region be acceptable? And for example, that even happened in Myanmar. When Myanmar tried to block access to Twitter, it actually resulted in Twitter getting blocked even in India because of the measures followed by telcos there. But that just shows we need to confront these matters. And when companies do comply, what happens is they keep coming under more pressure. And Vietnam has just increased the number of requests being sent there and leaving them no space to really do checks, which reminds us that basically never depend on Facebook. Have these conversations in open fora between democracies or within democracies. The other thing I just wanted to refer to, and Friedrich touched upon, was this phenomenon of leaving the internet on still. And I think he's absolutely right that in Myanmar, one of the reasons why they leave the internet on is it's so crucial for business and for the junta's own businesses, right? Remember, the Myanmar military is deeply enmeshed in capitalism and private sector enterprises. But also, they see the differential. For example, while shutdowns happen from 1 a.m. to 9 a.m. in most townships across the country, in Yangon, they started extending the shutdown because protests are so actively happening there. And what you've seen, for example, in India occasionally, where they always shut down mobile internet access, but they leave fixed line access because the rich, the elite, businesses, and even government entities have access to fixed line connectivity. And the majority of everyday people with a cell phone don't. And that's something, therefore, you should need to be careful about. That just because they don't switch off the internet completely doesn't mean that actually it doesn't disrupt everyday people's access. And lastly, on democracies and this open political conversation, one, I think democracies everywhere need to realize when you say something, even if it's provocative or even if it's coming from a legitimate concern, it can be misconstrued elsewhere. And I'll give you an example of that. The German NetzDG law is often cited and referred to by other countries. But in the context of internet shutdowns, what's often referred to is the fact that when the London riots happened several years ago under Prime Minister David Cameron's term, he made comments saying social media is responsible for this, perhaps let's shut down social media. That didn't happen. He summoned executives, he talked to them, but they did not shut down access. But since then, the constant meme, and you can find Indian policymakers who will say this on record, of course, the UK shut down the internet during the London riots. How can you say what we're doing is not legitimate? And you have to point out to them, no, it didn't happen. And had post facto, they said it was unconstitutional if they had done that, but also very ineffective. And this goes lastly to Frederick's other point, that sometimes governments don't shut down the internet because they're trying to monitor users, or they do targeted shutdowns or throttling to force activists or journalists to use less secure technologies because they can spy on them. And as we've commented about Myanmar, we know about the shutdowns. We don't know enough about surveillance. We know a bit more because of the New York Times and Myanmar groups revealing stuff to us. But we need to remember that shutdowns are now part of this arsenal of technologies used by not just less repressive governments, sometimes less enlightened policymakers in democracies as well.
Thank you so much. Being mindful of the time, we have approximately 13, 14 minutes left. Shashank, there's a question that I want to, from our viewers, which I want to pass on to you from Devarati Guha, who is with Deutsche Welle, apparently. She says, recently Twitter blocked access to some 250 accounts linked to the protest farmers in India. And now, according to a document shared by the Internet Freedom Foundation, a new set of rules, namely Information Technology Rules 2021, is supposed to come out. What does it mean for the largest democracy in the world, is Debarati asking.
Yeah, I'll keep that brief since this is a conversation around internet shutdowns. But basically, what is happening in India is recently, Twitter sort of opposed the blockage of certain media houses and their channels on their platform, and there was a quite well reported tussle between the Indian government and Twitter, recently. It's to all our imagination, the timing of these sort of regulations. But recently, last week, the government has come out with an overarching, very sort of broad internet regulation in the form of what we popularly know as the intermediary liability rules here in India. And they just don't impact social media, but they also impact digital news services and OTT contents as content providers as well. So including on Netflix and Amazon's or Amazon Prime's. So there are a number of problematic and controversial, I would say, provisions in the regulation. I can talk about the key ones being one being the popularly known as the traceability requirement, which basically is in effect targeted at end-to-end encrypted applications, which Indians very, very popularly use for certain services. India is the largest market for such services, and they rely on these services for doing work, ordering from e-commerce, payments, and being connected to their loved ones and friends and family. So, and actually quite actively also engaging and exercising their democratic rights through gathering information and sharing it with society. And the Indian government sort of asked to identify the first originator of a message through these regulations, which security experts have again and again said that which would end up breaking end-to-end encryption for these messaging services. The other being sort of the very, very, very craftily drafted in the Indian regulation, the requirement of automated filters, and we're seeing, as Raman was saying, The Indian government is relying on a lot of conversation and policy thinking which is happening in Europe, whether it's the conversation around the copyright directive, whether it's the conversation around the next DG law, whether it's conversations around the Digital Services Act and the package there. A lot of these suggestions, or in fact, I would like to point out to some controversial decisions of the ECJ as well, where there have been indications of using, sort of partially using automated filters, which have been translated into law in India now. Of course, I would say that these provisions will have, because of the broad overture of these, the language used in these regulations, it definitely will. It has the scope of having an impact on the constitutional rights of everyday Indians. And I want to close that by saying that it gives more authority to the Indian government to regulate what we see in digital news media, which is increasingly becoming the popular source of information, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic.
We're in the final stretch, last 10 minutes. Frederick, let's do a final round. Obviously, we've talked for the previous 50 minutes in detail about how damning, how detrimental internet shutdowns are in Asia, pointing out several countries. You have lived in that part of the region now for some time. You know several countries quite well. How do you think this is going to play out in the long run? What gives you hope? What makes you hopeful that things will improve? If not in the short, then certainly in the long term.
Well, I have to say I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. So since I live here, which is already since 7 or 8 years, freedom has been more and more limited in any ways, and in actually each and every country. Here in South Asia, right now maybe I don't see any exception. Maybe Indonesia. So I think the outlook right now is rather grim. And what I also see is that maybe in the future, internet shutdowns might not be the real threat. The real threat are maybe highly controlled internet. Because, as we see in Myanmar, the governments, they don't want to shut down the internet because they need it by themselves. But they want to have an internet that they can use for their own purposes. And I think China is the example here. I'm not an expert on China, but I don't think that we see shutdowns there, right? Because they don't need to shut it down. They just use it in the way that they benefit. And I think this is like what we also see in Myanmar right now. They simply lack they are not sophisticated enough, and they don't have the technology to control the internet as much as they want. So they simply shut it down. And I think it's crucial to stop this process of giving governments the instruments to control the internet as they want to.
Thank you so much. Gide, as a German parliamentarian whose work is primarily focused on human rights, you've been to many countries, looking particularly at the situation in Asia with a very narrow focus on internet shutdowns. From your experience as a parliamentarian looking at other countries and continents, how do you think this is going to play out? What possible scenarios do you foresee?
Well, I think Frederick made a very important point by saying internet shutdowns might not be the tool for the future by trying to oppress civil society and the freedom of expression, but rather an internet that is up and running, but very much censored by the country's government. And China has been this example, and I would definitely say this is the case. And China is the example and role model for many countries in the region that just creates their own Facebook, their own Twitter, their own feeds and applications. I just want to bring up something that has not been touched upon yet, I think, and that's the role of women in this whole process. I think if we see in general how women's participation rights have been neglected in very many countries, not only in Asia, but also these kind of censorships on the internet and internet shutdowns increasingly also roll back women's rights that have successfully been fought for in the past months and years, I think that is a thing that is very counterproductive for women's rights in the region, but also worldwide. So maybe we can, I'm going to try that, but society and government should focus on these very special, not groups, because women are the majority of the world's population, and they play a very important role in grassroots organizations and thinking forward, as men do as well. So I think these two parts are crucial to the debate and bringing it up all the time. But thank you also for the insights of Frederick, Shashank, and Raman. I learned a lot myself as well.
And that's what discussions like these are there for, to exchange and enrich one another, and hopefully then ultimately improve the situation. We have 5 minutes left before we go. We started with Raman. We're going to end with Raman. Shashank, I just want to give you an opportunity, 60 seconds, just quickly. What makes you optimistic? What makes you hopeful? Frederick wasn't quite as hopeful and optimistic. Would you concur with Frederick, or is your outlook a bit more positive?
I think being a policy researcher and a lawyer in India working on human rights, I think for positivity is the way to go. I think I would say that there's a lot of work to do. I think, and Raman started with this thread that, if I look at the previous 5 years where we were with internet shutdowns in India, I think there's a lot of conversation. There is an involvement by courts to some extent. Civil society and academia is getting involved in the conversation. I know that it's difficult to sort of get businesses to talk about this, but I know that they're much aware of the impact. I think as we sort of go through the years and we continue to push slightly forward on this agenda, as I mentioned previously, I think what I'd like to see personally as well is the right to access of internet being recognized as a fundamental right in this country, as sort of in advanced democracies as well. So I'd sort of like to finish with that thought. I'm hopeful, and hopefully all our work together will push the buck forward.
Optimistic by default comes with the territory. Raman, you kicked off the session, and we're going to end with you. There's also another question in the Q&A forum from Marion Renken, who's asking specifically about the situation in Sri Lanka. Don't know if you want to touch upon it now or in writing, but to close the session with some final remarks and some concluding words.
Happy to, and I think Marion's question is an excellent one to just frame this. In Sri Lanka, what took place were internet shutdowns, firstly to prevent communal tension, supposedly in 2018, and then shutdowns after the terror bombings, the horrific terror bombings in 2019. And what you saw was that they weren't necessarily helpful for the main purpose, and technologists, public interest groups, and others raised concerns. You have not seen shutdowns in Sri Lanka afterwards, but you've seen a massive decline in the situation with worries about surveillance and targeted measures impacting civil society. And so you have to remember, shutdowns are often a warning sign. They're part of a package now. They normally presage other surveillance or targeted censorship or a decline in freedoms in a country. And so when you see shutdowns occur, you really need to jump into the domestic political conversation. If you're a domestic actor, or if you're an international friend, have an open conversation with your democratic friend in that country. And I think that's what you need to remember here, that shutdowns are happening. They won't only be shutdowns. You'll also have a blocking of VPN services, surveillance measures, or as you see, a China-type model of whitelisting of internet services. And this is not abstract. This is what happened for a while in Jammu and Kashmir in India when they were lifting the internet restrictions. They said, we'll allow you to access the internet, but through particular computers the government controls or particular websites the government has whitelisted. And to many Indians, that was horrific because that seems to be like China. That was changed, but it was there for several weeks. And lastly, therefore, what you must keep in mind is I'm optimistic, but I think things will get a bit worse before they get better. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be prepared for that honest discussion that shutdowns are actually, to be honest, never acceptable. I think we should say that. And therefore, we should engage in that legal reform conversation, that political conversation that Shashank and others mentioned, domestically, internationally, and elsewhere, to end this scourge, because the issue is not just denial of internet access. It's a political culture around access to communications and collaboration through the internet that you are creating. Not just, I can't access the internet, but you looking over your shoulder, wondering, is it safe for me to do so? Because I might be brought to harm by a bad malicious criminal actor, or perhaps an overzealous or unlawfully acting police officer. And that's what we need to prevent. So the next 2 years are crucial.
The next 2 years are crucial, and things will probably get worse before they get better, says Raman, despite being an optimist. I think I speak for all who have joined this discussion. This has been very enriching, very informative, very educational session on internet shutdowns and how they are being implemented, how they are being dealt with, and what detriment they're causing on the continent of Asia. Many thanks to Raman Chima, Gide Jensen, Shashank Mohan, and Frederick Spohr for a very spirited, very educational discussion. This wraps up the second edition of the Web Talk series titled "This Service is Currently Unavailable." Do monitor the website of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for information on the third and last session. Thank you so much for joining. To our 4 speakers, thank you so much for joining. To our listeners and the questions you have submitted throughout, all the best, stay safe, and see you all soon.